Hi everyone, Brian Valerio, VP in the Proxy Solicitation Group at Alliance Advisors, back with another corporate governance alert. So ISS recently released a series of preliminary FAQs on its approach to how it's going to analyze and evaluate pay decisions relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the FAQs that they released are going to provide you with some general guidance on how the research team may look at and analyze and approach COVID-related pay decisions. There are 4 key areas that I'm going to discuss today: temporary salary reductions, changes to annual incentive programs, changes to long-term incentive programs, and COVID-related retention or other one-time awards. These are all discussed in greater detail in the FAQs, and I'm going to give you a link to it so that you can access the full FAQs if you want to look into those issues or some of the other issues that they discuss in greater detail. But let me start by talking about the temporary salary reductions and how ISS is going to potentially view these in the upcoming proxy season. So ISS's view is ultimately going to depend on the total pay impact. And this is because it recognizes that base salaries make up a small portion of the total pay for high-level executives. So the amount of mitigation and the amount of mitigating weight that ISS is going to give a reduction in the base salary is going to depend on the extent of the overall reduction in total pay. Now let's move on to the second point, which is changes to the annual incentive programs. So the big ticket item here, the big overarching theme here, is that ISS is going to view some changes, or may view some changes that would generally be regarded as being problematic or things that they don't like, as reasonable this year because of the COVID pandemic, if the rationale is clearly disclosed and that the ultimate outcome is reasonable in ISS's view. So some of the key highlights here are, this is going to relate to changes to metrics or performance targets or measurement periods for the annual incentive pay programs. And it could also potentially relate to the suspension of annual programs and the use of one-time discretionary payments. Now, ISS may view these actions as being reasonable if there's extraordinary circumstances that were caused by the economic downturn, and there's a clear disclosure explaining the rationale behind the decisions to make these changes, and the resulting outcome, or basically what happened, the ultimate payout, was also reasonable. So the FAQs are going to provide more examples of the types of disclosures that ISS would want to see if you want to take a look at that. Going on to the third big key in these proposed FAQs, or these preliminary released FAQs, are changes to the long-term long-term incentive plans. And these are for cycles that are already in progress, right? So if they're already happening, these long-term plans. So now ISS generally is going to view changes to the long-term cycles negatively. They're not going to like these changes as a general rule. But if it's a small change and there are some disclosures around the change and it's for the most recent year and the change is reasonable, you might get a little bit of leeway from ISS. But ultimately, ISS is probably going to view these changes to the long-term cycle in a negative light. And this is just essentially due to consistent feedback that ISS gets from its clients, the institutional investors, that long-term incentives shouldn't be changed during a cycle based on market volatility, essentially. But if you do provide some disclosure that provides some rationale that allows the investors to understand the decision and why it took place, you might see some leeway here. Again, this is going to be touched on in greater detail in the FAQs if you want some more specific examples to look at. The fourth main takeaway from this are COVID-related retention or one-time awards. So ISS recognizes that some companies are going to have to or may grant one-time awards to address the challenges that companies have faced in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a unique circumstance. ISS recognizes that and understands that companies are going to potentially go outside of their traditional mechanisms and use these one-time awards. And ISS's cautionary tale here is that companies should disclose the rationale for these awards and describe how those awards ultimately align investor interests with the management. So those are the 4 key takeaways that I took from the ISS FAQs on how it's going to view proxy pay disclosures for the upcoming season in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Like I said, there's a link to the article if you want to take a look at the FAQs for yourself and dig into them a little deeper, or please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.